Sorry. That's my fault. I had it muted and I forgot to unmute it. I apologize, everybody. So it was on my end. Anyway, as I was saying, welcome everybody to our daily devotional for today, June the 29th, Monday. Apologize for my hat. We have company coming in this afternoon, and so I just didn't have time to get my hair did. So I'd like to examine a passage in Romans chapter 13 and verse 8. So in Romans chapter 13 and in verse 8, Paul, and the broader context of chapter 13, of course, talks about submission to the authorities that be. And then he says in verse 8, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves another has fulfilled the law." Paul isn't saying that we can't have mortgages or car payments or credit cards or anything like that. That's not what Paul's point is. His point speaks to the greater end of emphasizing taking care of others, loving others. So when he says, "Owe no man or owe no one anything except to love one another," it's the idea of someone having leverage over you, someone being able to manipulate you because you owe them, and that kind of speaks more to that angle compared to loving another. And so it's again, some people have read this and say, does that mean we can't have debt at all? Does that mean we can't have a mortgage? No, that's not what Paul's saying. Verse 9, "For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, you shall not covet. If there is any other commandment, all are summed up in this saying, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now keep in mind, Paul's not quoting Old Testament just for the fun of it. All of this has been incorporated back into the New Testament. And so even though he is quoting Old Testament commandments, all of these are contained within the new law. And that's what verse 8 is. Because keep in mind, Paul's not concerned with obeying the old law anymore. The old law is no longer binding. And so when he says he who loves another has fulfilled the law, they have fulfilled the new law. Because why should we, Jew or Gentile, be concerned about fulfilling the old law? We're not. But he does describe all of these to show the consistency between the old law and the new law and what God requires of the people of faith. So verse 10, "Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore love is the fulfillment of the law." And so when Paul describes love does no harm to a neighbor, love takes into account what others need, and it takes into account how best we can help others. Love is not self-centered. It doesn't consider oneself first. So in verse 11, he says, "And do this, knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep." So when he says, "and do this," okay, do what? Well, specifically, love your neighbor. Okay, that's the specific. Do this, knowing the time. Okay, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. So love your neighbor, but in an even broader way, fulfill the law. Okay, and do this. Fulfill the law. Love is the specific that Paul has addressed, but even more broadly, fulfill the law. That's where the focus needs to be. Knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. This is similar to what Brother Keith says on a regular occasion. We're one day closer to death or one day closer to the Lord's return, whichever comes first. Either way, we're one day closer. This is kind of what Paul is describing, that it is high time to awake out of sleep. The idea being that don't get lulled into a false sense of routine, the sense of everything has continued as it always has, nothing's going to change, tomorrow's going to be here just like today was. Don't get lulled into that false sense of routine and that nothing's going to change. Always be prepared, always be ready, be on alert. And that's what Paul's emphasis is. The night is far spent, verse 12. The day is at hand. Therefore, let us cast off the works of darkness. Let us put on the armor of light. Again, one of the specific works of darkness is doing harm to a neighbor, not having love for a neighbor. And certainly Paul wants to emphasize that angle. But even more broadly, again, is not fulfilling the law. Okay? Casting off the works of darkness is going contrary to what the law says, being transgressors of the law. But instead, we are to cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. And that speaks to the nature of change. You see this awake versus sleep. You see night versus day. You see darkness versus light. You see this contrast that Paul is describing. And yes, there is a broader sense of when I was a Christian, I was asleep. I was in darkness. I was in the night, so to speak. Now that I am a Christian, I am to be awake. I am to be in the day, in the light. But Paul describes, verse 11, that our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. He's not just speaking broadly in the sense of the contrast before Christian and after now I've become a Christian. He's actually speaking about individuals who are Christians, but they're not doing what they should be doing. Okay, and that's part of the broader context of Romans. Okay, he addresses, in a lot of ways, he does condemn the Jewish brethren in Rome because they were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. Chapter 2. They were judging hypocritically, judging the things that the Gentile Christians might do, which the things that they were doing may have been wrong, but then they weren't holding that same standard to themselves. And so Paul is emphasizing the need for them to be better, to grow, to no longer give themselves to those types of things and simply justify themselves because, well, I'm a Christian. Well, you can be a Christian and be asleep. You can be a Christian and be in the darkness. And that's what the specific is that Paul's dealing with here. He says, let us walk properly, as in the day, not in revelry and drunkenness, not in lewdness and lust, not in strife and envy. Excuse me, why would Paul bother saying that if there's not an application there for current Christians who were guilty of walking in revelry and drunkenness and lewdness and lust and strife and envy? Because there were some. And that's why Paul says, let us walk properly, as in the day. See, and the idea here is that in the light of truth, people's deeds are seen. And so the idea of nighttime in the darkness, people can do things even secretly, thinking they're getting away with sin. And that's kind of the idea here, is that the darkness, in the hidden moments, the things that aren't open to the light and open to the eyes of others, people involve themselves in things that they shouldn't. Sometimes even Christians. And that's what Paul's pointing out, is that we need to walk properly. We need to put on the armor of light because we've been called to a purpose. And then in verse 14 he says, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts. Notice we are to put on the armor of light and put on the Lord Jesus Christ. So the armor of light, the attributes, the characteristics of the armor of light have everything to do with the Lord Jesus Christ. Putting on his character, putting on his mind. Of course, 1 Peter chapter 4, the mind that was in Jesus was to not sin. And that needs to be our mind. And that's certainly part of the context of verse 14 of chapter 13. The importance of the brethren being mindful that, think about Ephesians chapter 6 and the armor that a Christian is to put on, the breastplate of righteousness, the sword of the Spirit, and so forth. All of these characteristics are what Christ has commanded of us, his people. And as a result, these are the types of things that we need to focus on. So all of this text, certainly, Paul kind of springboards from talking about loving one another and the importance of fulfilling the law to applying that even more broadly. Okay, and certainly when we talk about works of darkness or being asleep, revelry, drunkenness, lewdness, lust, strife, and envy, none of those have love for a neighbor, first of all, much less love for God. And that's kind of the springboard to which Paul addresses more broadly the need for the brethren to be proper in their conduct. So, all right, so that's the daily devotional for us today, everybody. Again, I know I don't usually wear a hat. I don't know if that bothers anybody. I'm sorry if it does. But like I said, we've got company coming in about an hour, and we've been preparing for that, and I just didn't have time to run and get my hair done. So I hope everybody's okay with that. All right, so remember tomorrow afternoon, 6:30 for our next daily devotional for Tuesday, and then Wednesday night at 7 Central, we'll have our Bible study, 1 Timothy chapter 3, and the qualifications of elders, and a couple of hymns as well. So I appreciate everybody being with us tonight. I hope everyone has a good night, and y'all take care, stay safe, and Lord willing, I'll see you tomorrow night.